Recently, I gave the SAT with about a month of preparation and somehow managed to get a 1520. In this video, I'll talk about how I did it, because as we all know, one of the most noble things an individual can do is capitalize on the fear of students. Now just a quick disclaimer before we get into the video. In this video, I'm not really going to talk about what I studied for the SAT. Instead, I'll focus more on how I practiced for the test and some things I learned along the way, such as the fact that having an ugly haircut does not impede on your ability to do well on the test. First, let's talk about how I began. You can find 8 practice tests on the College Board website with answers and explanations. Before even registering for the SAT, I took a practice test, just to see where I stood in society. I believe I got a 1410, and decided to register for the test. Now if you get a score lower than mine on your first try, all it means is that you're worse than me, and you should be disappointed in your entire existence. After registering, I took a couple more practice tests, but I didn't take all of the practice tests in a row. After taking about 4 of them, I took some time off to analyze where I was going wrong, and I'd recommend that you do the same. Depending on the mistakes you make, you'll have to take steps accordingly. If you face trouble trying to understand the questions, you might have to spend some time learning the concepts on which the questions are based. However, if you can understand every question, but still get incorrect answers, you might need to focus more on optimizing your test-taking strategy and avoiding mistakes. So I started figuring out a test-taking strategy. For the reading section, there's a lot of dispute about how you should read the passages. Some prefer skimming through them and going back after reading each question. Some prefer spending a lot of time reading and barely going back while answering. I find myself somewhere in the middle. I put just enough time and effort while reading to get a decent understanding of what the passage is trying to say. While answering, I only go back for specific types of questions, such as when they ask what part of the text gives the answer to the previous question, or how the text progresses, or something based on a graph or chart. Something you should keep in mind when it comes to the reading section is that many of these questions are designed to trick you. Be very careful while reading the question and selecting the answer. Sometimes you get choices that have multiple parts to them. Make sure all parts of your answer are correct. If any one of them is wrong, the choice is wrong. For the writing and language section, I mostly relied on instinct. If you're able to read and speak the English language properly, you should be able to answer most of these questions. However, a few of the questions may still seem tricky. 2 or 3 choices may seem like the correct answer for a question. In these situations, I like to go with whichever sounds the best or seems the most simple. I especially rely on this when it comes to punctuation. I always try to avoid unnecessary commas or other punctuation. Lastly, I would suggest that you go online and read a bit about the use of different punctuation marks. Where are colons, or semicolons, or dashes used? You might think you already know this, and you probably do, but a little bit of research may give you a small new piece of important information. Lastly, we come over to the math section. Now this might be a little self-explanatory, but this section might require you to understand a little bit of math. Obviously, you don't need to show your work or anything, but I still recommend that you write things out, even when you can use a calculator. You can save some things for mental calculation, such as adding 2 and 2. But the moment you encounter a more complex equation, write it down. You might be very confident in yourself and think you'll save some time, but you're really just increasing your chances of making a stupid mistake. And there's really no point to exhibiting your mental math swag if you end up getting the wrong answer. Also, read the math questions very carefully and understand exactly what the question is asking for. Take a look at this question. You skim through the equation, solve it, and x is equal to 10. You've got your answer. But that's wrong, because the question asks for x divided by 5, so the answer is actually 2. So make sure you read each question very carefully. Putting all these measures in place, I took the rest of my practice tests. Of course, checking what I did wrong after each test. I was performing significantly better than earlier, consistently scoring over 1500. I even scored a 1560 on the last 2 tests. A few days later, I gave the SAT. The only difference between the practice and the real test was that the bubbles on the answer sheet were different. I gave this test with a great level of self-assessed swagger, but also a great sense of nervousness. But once I gave the test, I completely forgot about it. Actually, that was a lie. I couldn't think of anything else for 14 days. I eventually got my result, a 780 in math and a 740 in English. With the use of advanced mathematics, you can figure out that gives us an overall score of 1520. Now, I was initially hoping for a 1550 or above, because let's be honest, how I scored a 1550 plus on the SAT with 1 month of prep sounds like a much more appealing title for a YouTube video. Anyway, I got 7 questions wrong on the reading section, 3 questions wrong on the writing and language section, and 2 questions wrong on the math section. So, obviously not perfect, but not too bad for my first try, I'd say. Now, do keep in mind that even if you get the same number of questions right on each section as me, that still doesn't ensure you'll get the same score. College Board sets a different curve for each test depending on how hard it is. Now, I gave the SAT with essay, so you might be wondering why I didn't talk about the essay yet in this video. And that's because of a totally arbitrary reason, and obviously not because I was dissatisfied with my score. Obviously. Lastly, I'd just like to say, don't take any of this too seriously. If you get a score you're not satisfied with, you might be able to give the SAT again. And even if you're not, that's completely alright. At the end of the day, this is just a test, and getting a bad score on a test is not the end of the world.